Earlier, I spoke to Kurt Volker, a former US ambassador to NATO and special representative for Ukraine negotiations in the Trump administration. When we spoke in January, you said that Mr. Putin had put all the forces in place for a large invasion, I'm quoting you there, and it was more likely than not that he would use them. Could we have done more to deter him?
Yes, it's unfortunate but true. You know, we could see it. We could see the buildup of forces. We heard his rhetoric. We knew he had made demands that could not be met. So it was just becoming increasingly clear that he would invade. I wasn't sure whether it would be trying to take over the whole country and depose the government or just take parts of eastern Ukraine. And sadly, what he is very clear about now is he wants to kill Zelenskyy, decapitate the government, and control the entire country.
And do you think that he really is completely bent on his war aim now, come what may, irrespective of casualties and international condemnation and so on?
Yes, in fact, I think he has given himself no way out. He launched this military operation on the thought that it might last 2 or 3 days. It would be fairly easy. They would take over Ukraine. Obviously not true. Russian forces are bogged down in many places. They've suffered a lot of casualties, a lot of equipment losses. And now these sanctions have kicked in that are truly significant against the Russian economy. So he has to win to save face, to save himself, to remain in power. Because if he fails in Ukraine and the economy is tanking, I would not be surprised to see people in Russia start to question his leadership.
Do you think this is what might be called the cornered rat problem? That actually, if you corner the rat, he or she will just become more savage and do things that in other circumstances would be unimaginable?
Yes, that's true. And we're seeing it already. So Russian, multiple rocket launchers are firing at civilian populations, apartment buildings and cities in Kharkiv and Mariupol and Kherson, in Kyiv, and missile strikes on civilian targets in cities. Aircraft, they haven't gained air superiority yet, but they are trying to, and they want to completely suppress the population by breaking its will and defeating the military on the battlefield.
Mr. Biden, in his State of the Union address this week, I think devoted not much more than about 10 minutes to Ukraine, which seems like a surprise given the circumstances. Do you think that was an indication that in reality the United States now thinks that there's relatively little it can do to change the course of Mr. Putin's actions?
Well, first off, I do want to give President Biden credit on two fronts. One of them, he did speak extensively about Ukraine. 10 minutes in a State of the Union is significant, and it's the first topic he brought up. So he gave it some priority. And secondly, his rhetoric about defending democracy and standing up to Putin's aggression, I thought that rhetoric was great. The problem is that the actions have not matched that rhetoric. And we have been intimidated by Russia, I would say, fearing that he might reach for a nuclear weapon, fearing a direct conflict with Russian forces that could escalate. And so rather than deterring Russia, he is deterring us.
Well, you've set out this week in an article a number of things that you think that the West, that NATO could be doing. And in particular, you've taken note of what the Ukrainians themselves have been saying, that they want NATO to establish a no-fly zone. You've called for that in a more limited fashion, I think, than President Zelensky's talked about, to cover Kiev and humanitarian routes out of the Ukraine. How would that work?
Well, first off, we've done this in the past. We've executed no-fly zones. We've done it over the Kurdish areas in Iraq, for example, when Saddam Hussein was attacking them. So we know how to do this. There is a protocol for this. Secondly, we make very clear this is for humanitarian purposes only. We are there to prevent attacks on the civilian population from the air. And we do this over Kiev and Western Ukraine, so it's limited geographically. We are not coming close to Russian borders. And we make very clear the rules of engagement. We will not be striking any ground targets, any Russian forces, unless fired upon. And we will not be striking any Russian aircraft or helicopters, provided they remain outside the zone. And if they enter the zone, then there's a protocol of escalating tactics to escort them out. But if they refuse, then there would be the prospect of firing on them. But many ways to avoid that. And I think the Russians will understand this as well. They might test us, but then I think they don't want to draw us into a larger conflict either.
Well, let me push back a little bit on that. Do you really think that Mr. Putin is going to play by rules that NATO has set out? He hasn't been interested in NATO, what NATO's had to say about anything thus far.
Yeah, I think it's force that he respects. It's force that he listens to, not the rules that are stated. So if he sees that we are doing it and we are prepared to follow through, I think he will adjust.
But of course, what people worry about is that his reaction might not be the reasonable one that you've just set out, but simply to say, this is an act of war. We are now at war. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to win this war with every force at my disposal. And we know what that means, including chemical, biological, and nuclear.
Yeah, which would be horrific. And if that is the kind of dictator and aggressor that we are dealing with in Europe today, then we also know he won't stop at Ukraine. He wants to subdue Ukraine. He'll move on to Moldova. I think that was already in the plans. He'll look at Georgia, and he may even be looking at the Baltic states, which we have an obligation to defend. So I think it is prudent to take steps now to assist the Ukrainians as they have an organized government and military and are fighting back, rather than waiting until it is disorganized in Ukraine and Putin is in a dominant position and moving on to other pieces of the empire.
Let me ask you, I guess, a question that I put to you in our previous interview. If we don't, for example, introduce a no-fly zone, is it your view that ultimately the Ukrainians are going to have to submit to Russian control?
No, I think the Ukrainians are going to continue fighting. And even if the Russians manage to kill Zelenskyy, and even if they manage to break the military organization, then the Ukrainians will be fighting from the cities and the woods in an internal insurgency against a Russian occupying force. This is going to go on regardless.
So this is potentially what our own Foreign Secretary called, before the invasion, the potential for a quagmire for the Russians. I think she was calling to mind Afghanistan, maybe the first Chechen war.
Yeah, the difference between a quagmire, as we would understand it, and what would be happening in Ukraine under those circumstances is the Russians are absolutely brutal. They won't play by any rules of nicety. They will kill civilians indiscriminately. They will be incredibly brutal. And that is, again, another reason we should be looking at ways to stop this before it happens.
Let me just ask you lastly one thing, which as a former official, you've served under a number of presidents, including President Trump. It's been said to me, actually, on television this week, that were President Trump in the White House, Mr. Putin would never have dared to be so audacious, so brutal, so aggressive. Do you agree with that?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know. I think there is an element to which President Trump was highly unpredictable. And I think Putin was not sure what Trump would do. I also think that he believed that Trump was comfortable using force. Look at the way we took out the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or pushed back in Syria and against ISIS. There was a bit of aggressiveness in the approach, which I think Putin saw, and that also increased uncertainty. But that being said, Putin is bent on this mission to rebuild the Russian Empire on the ashes of the former Soviet Union. He wants to regather the territories. He's been explicit about it. And so I think his being driven to do this would be the case whether it was President Trump or President Biden.